Hello, it's Parm King, the Dungeon Master of Legends of Barovia, and today's Dungeon Master tip is about the NPC and moral ambiguity and player conflict. Frequently, we only focus on player conflict as being combat, whether it's melee combat, range, or spell casting. But a very important element in role-playing is player conflict with NPCs. What makes great fantasy stories such as Game of Thrones and The Witcher is when characters face moral ambiguities. Seemingly good characters do bad things and bad characters do good things. It is this conflict in our individuals and characters who face certain issues in their own agendas that create a more real-world immersive experience. I don't think it's been talked about too much in Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing, but I think it's an important element for us as Dungeon Masters to incorporate. Now, the first thing to do when incorporating this moral ambiguity into your NPCs is to set player expectations when they play the game. Frequently, players will wish or almost demand that NPCs behave a certain way or follow their instructions, but that doesn't always necessarily happen. So, telling your players and having a conversation before your sessions or before even starting a campaign explaining the concept of player conflict is important. And what we want to do as Dungeon Masters is not create conflict between ourselves and the players, but create that conflict between the player characters and the NPCs. How do we do that, and why is it important? Well, first of all, it's important because it adds an element of uncertainty. It adds volatility to the game. It forces the player characters to come up with creative solutions, searching for alternatives, or perhaps figuring out a way to compromise or even attempt to manipulate an NPC into doing what they want to do. How do I do that as a Dungeon Master? Well, it's difficult. It's extremely difficult. And it's difficult because we have particular NPCs that are there to help players. And we want to help the players on a personal level because as a Dungeon Master, we want our players to have this positive experience. And we have to objectively focus on the agenda and the needs and the situation of our NPCs. One of the things that I do with each of my NPCs is create a very simple backstory for each of them. I highlight their agenda. I highlight or bullet point certain aspects of that character that determines how that character's behavior will be with NPCs, but also determine their decision-making tree when engaging with NPCs. Let me give you an example. We're playing the campaign Curse of Strahd, which is a beautiful campaign when we talk about player conflict and moral ambiguity. One of the characters earlier in the campaign is in the village of Barovia. It's Ismark. His father was the burgomaster, the mayor of the village, who's passed away. He is not treated with any respect by the village, even though that in the village he is now the new mayor, the new burgomaster. He's inherited that. He's under extreme amount of pressure from Lord Strahd, and he feels entitled. He feels entitled to the respect that his title has, being the new burgomaster, yet the town and the villagers don't respect him. He's also doing the best he can to protect his sister. He welcomes the NPC's help, needs their help, but at the same time, he feels that he needs to command respect, that he feels that the player should be listening to him. It's his town. He is the boss. This creates a unique dynamic between the NPC playing that NPC and their interactions with the players. Not all the time will the NPC behave the way the players wish him to behave. And I created that conflict in his home when the players were in his home, they were under attack, and he had a conflict with the players, telling the players what he wanted the players to do, even though that Ismark might be wrong, even though the players might be right, ultimately from an objective point of view. From the subjective truth of Ismark, it is his home, it is his village, and he feels entitled, almost demands that respect. This created a conflict with our players and our player characters and Ismark the NPC. It's important that when we want to create these conflicts, that we as the dungeon master and as the players let the players know that these types of situations will happen. How does the player interact with somebody that's not going to behave the way they expect them to? How is the players going to be able to maybe persuade Ismark that what they're doing is the best course of action? Many times as dungeon masters, and you'll experience this, and even players will say, well, that character's acting stupid, he shouldn't do that, or he wouldn't do that. That may be true from their perspective, but when you empathize and try to understand why is Ismark behaving this particular way, it creates more clarity into the reason of this particular interaction. It is these types of conflictive interactions, these sometimes stressful interactions, that really heighten the game experience. I think it's an important element that we as Dungeon Masters need to include, but at the same time be careful that we don't let this conflict between player characters and NPC turn into perhaps a conflict between the DM and actual players. We had another recent situation in the last session where one of the hunters that I was playing as the NPC charged the wolf, and I made a conscious decision that he would charge the wolf because he was engaged to and was getting paid to protect the players and get them to the next village of Kresic. Unfortunately, and this is due to die rolls, the wolf rolled a critical and ended up killing the NPC, and the players thought his actions were necessarily stupid. And that's a fair criticism, and in retrospect, it probably was stupid. One of the things we need to think about playing NPCs in combat situation is we have to remember each turn represents 6 seconds. If we look at this from a reality standpoint, we don't have that much time to sit back and contemplate our actions. In those 6 seconds of combat, really it's muscle memory. What am I doing immediately? We don't have the foresight, nor do we have the ability to take time in making decisions. Combat is supposed to represent this 6 seconds where I'm making probably mostly a muscle memory reaction. Should the NPC have engaged with this wolf or possibly other wolves? Well, in retrospect, he probably shouldn't. Should he have disengaged and taken off? Well, he probably should have. But as the DM playing this particular NPC, looking at him as an individual, there was a couple of things that I thought about in addition. Number one was he's a hunter of wolves. He's also probably a man who has serious complex of superiority as being this guide to these players. This is his domain. He needs to be the leader, the hero, if you will, in his little world compared to the player's world. This is his element. He was trying to protect the players. He thought what he was doing was the right thing, the heroic thing to do. And effectively, it ended up costing his life. After the session, I recommend having a good conversation, a critical, constructive conversation with your players. Ask them what they like or didn't like about the last session. Ask them for their suggestions. And this is a really good time to explain to them why you, as the Dungeon Master, played particular NPCs a certain way. To sum this up in conclusion, I think one of the most important aspects of role-playing games is to bring in these character NPC conflicts. Create situations where your players have to use creative problem solvings on how to deal with these NPCs. NPCs shouldn't just be good or bad. They should be shades of gray. And introducing those shades of grays in an agenda is important. Again, a couple of tips. Create little backstories, maybe just little footnotes of each of your NPCs. Determine, because of those backstories and those agendas, how your NPCs should behave. Put some decision-making trees, in those notes on how your NPCs will react to the players. Also connect those NPCs possibly with other NPCs. I hope this was helpful. This is Parm King signing off till next time, and may all your rolls be critical 20s.